The well water had turned bitter after 8 days, tasting of fear and the iron tang that came from 3 small bodies pressed too close together in the darkness below ground. Sarah Marie clutched her sisters tighter as another set of boots thundered past overhead, the sound echoing down through the wooden cover like drums of judgment. At 14, she was old enough to understand what the screaming had meant 3 days past, old enough to know why Mama had shoved them down here with nothing but a water jug and the last of the cornbread wrapped in her good kitchen towel. "Sarah Marie," whispered 10-year-old Rebecca, her voice barely a breath against her sister's shoulder. "I can't feel my feet no more." "Hush now," Sarah Marie murmured, the words automatic after days of the same comfort offered over and over. "We got to be quiet as church mice, remember what Mama said." Little Emma, barely 6 and small for her age, had stopped crying 2 days ago. Now she just pressed her face into Sarah Marie's torn dress and breathed in tiny, careful sips like she was afraid to take up too much air. The child hadn't spoken since the second night when she tried to call for Mama, and Sarah Marie had to cover her mouth quick and firm. Above them, the footsteps stopped. Sarah Marie felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would give them away. Through the gaps in the well cover, she could see a sliver of morning light that meant another day was starting in the world above. 8 days since they'd heard Mama scream. 8 days since the house had burned. 8 days since the soldiers had come through Millbrook Settlement like a plague of locusts, taking everything and leaving nothing but ash and silence. The boots started moving again, but slower now, like whoever wore them was looking for something specific. Sarah Marie held her breath and tried to remember Mama's voice from that last morning, calm and steady as she always was when trouble came calling. "You girls listen to me now," Mama had said, pulling on her Sunday dress even though it was only Tuesday. "There's men coming who ain't got no business here, and they ain't gonna ask polite before they take what they want. Sarah Marie, you get your sisters down in that well and you don't come up for nothing, you hear me? Nothing at all until 3 days pass without a sound." "But Mama," Sarah Marie had started to protest. 3 days of quiet, child. That's how you'll know it's safe. And you take care of Rebecca and Emma like they was your own babies, because—" Mama's voice had caught then, just for a second, before she straightened her shoulders and smoothed her dark hair back. "Because that might be how the Lord intends it now." The memory made Sarah Marie's chest tight with grief she couldn't afford to feel, not yet, not while her sisters needed her to be strong. She shifted carefully, trying to ease the cramp in her left leg without making noise. The well wasn't deep enough to drown them, thank Providence, but it was narrow enough that moving was near impossible without bumping into the stone walls. "Sarah Marie," Rebecca whispered again, so quiet the sound was lost in the rustle of their clothes. "Is Mama coming back?" The question hung in the damp air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah Marie closed her eyes and tried to think of what to say, what words might comfort without being lies. She'd been asking herself the same question for 8 days, and every hour that passed made the answer clearer and more terrible. "I don't rightly know," she finally whispered back, because that was the closest to truth she could manage. "But we're gonna take care of each other no matter what, just like she said." Above them, the footsteps had moved away, but Sarah Marie could still hear voices carrying on the morning air. Men's voices, rough and tired sounding, talking about supplies and moving out. She strained to listen, hoping to catch something that would tell her if it was safe, if the 3 days of quiet Mama had promised might finally be starting. "Check that well before we head out," one voice was saying, too clear and too close. Sarah Marie's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She pressed her hand over Emma's mouth, gentle but firm, and felt Rebecca go rigid beside her. The 3 of them had become so still they might have been carved from stone, barely breathing, hearts beating in terrible unison. Heavy footsteps approached the well again, and this time they stopped right overhead. Sarah Marie could see the shadow of a man through the gaps in the wooden cover, blocking out the thin streams of morning light. "Probably just old water," another voice said, farther away. "We ain't got time to be checking every hole in the ground, Corporal." "Orders are orders," the first voice replied, and Sarah Marie heard the scrape of wood against stone as hands gripped the well cover. "Captain wants every hiding place checked before we move the column out." The cover lifted away, and sunlight poured down into their refuge like the light of Judgment Day. Sarah Marie squinted up, her eyes burning after 8 days of darkness, and saw the silhouette of a soldier looking down at them. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, nobody moved. Then the man above them spoke, his voice younger than she'd expected and strange with something that might have been shock. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "There's children down there." Sarah Marie blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, trying to see the face that went with the voice. When her eyes adjusted, she found herself looking up at a boy who couldn't be more than 17 or 18, with sandy hair falling across his forehead and gray eyes wide with what looked like horror. "3 little girls," the young soldier called over his shoulder, but his voice sounded strange, like he was having trouble getting the words out. "They're alive." "Well, pull 'em up then," came the answer from the other man. "Can't leave witnesses behind." The young soldier's face went white as fresh cotton. Sarah Marie saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard, saw his hands shake just slightly as they gripped the edge of the well. In that moment, she understood exactly what kind of witnesses the other man meant, and what happened to witnesses when armies moved through settlements like theirs. "Please," she whispered, the word torn from her throat after 8 days of enforced silence. "Please don't hurt my sisters." The young soldier stared down at her, and Sarah Marie saw something change in his expression. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice was steadier but pitched low so only she could hear. "How long you been down there?" 8 days, Sarah Marie whispered back. Since we came through." He finished the sentence she couldn't bear to speak, and she saw him close his eyes for just a moment. "Your folks." Sarah Marie felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not in front of her sisters. Not now. She just shook her head. The young soldier was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the 3 of them huddled together in the bottom of the well. Sarah Marie could hear other voices getting closer, boots on hard ground, the jingle of equipment and weapons. Time was running out, and they all knew it. "Listen to me," the soldier said suddenly, his voice urgent but still quiet. "My name's Private Daniel McKenna, and I'm gonna get you out of there. But when I do, you don't say nothing about how long you been hiding, you understand? You tell anybody who asks that you just fell down here this morning, that you been lost in the woods since yesterday. Can you remember that?" Sarah Marie nodded, hope and terror warring in her chest. "Yes, sir." "What's your name?" "Sarah Marie Hutchins." "This is Rebecca and Emma." "Good. Sarah Marie, you're the oldest, so you got to make sure your sisters remember the story. Lost in the woods yesterday, fell in the well this morning." "Say it back to me." "Lost in the woods yesterday, fell in the well this morning," Sarah Marie repeated, her voice getting stronger. "That's right. Now, when I pull you up, you're gonna be scared and crying, understand? You been lost and hungry and frightened, but you ain't been hiding from nothing because you ain't seen nothing. Can you do that?" Sarah Marie looked at her sisters, both of them watching her with wide, trusting eyes. Rebecca was old enough to understand at least some of what was happening, but Emma was just a baby who'd do whatever Sarah Marie told her to do. "We can do it," she whispered. "Good girl." Private McKenna straightened up and called over his shoulder. "They're just little things, probably been lost in the woods. Looks like they fell in trying to get water." "Well, get 'em out then," the other voice replied, closer now. "We got a schedule to keep." Private McKenna lowered a rope into the well, the hemp rough against Sarah Marie's hands as she tested its strength. 8 days of cramped muscles and little food had left her weak, but desperation gave her the power to tie the rope under Emma's arms and guide her small sister up toward the light. Private McKenna lifted Emma out gentle as handling a newborn calf, setting her down on the ground before lowering the rope again for Rebecca. Sarah Marie watched her middle sister disappear up into the sunlight, leaving her alone in the well for the first time in 8 days. When the rope came down for her, Sarah Marie said a quick prayer to whatever merciful God might be listening, asking for strength and courage and the wisdom to keep her sisters safe. Then she took hold of the rope and let Private McKenna pull her up into a world that had changed forever while they hid in the darkness below. The sunlight was blinding after 8 days in the well, and Sarah Marie stumbled as her feet touched solid ground. Her legs, weak from confinement, threatened to buckle, but she forced herself to stand straight and look around at the ruins of everything she'd ever known. Millbrook Settlement was gone. Where once there had been neat houses with kitchen gardens and white-painted fences, now there was only blackened timber and ash. The church where she'd been baptized was a skeleton of charred beams reaching toward heaven like the bones of some great beast. The schoolhouse where Miss Patterson had taught her to read was nothing but a chimney standing alone among the weeds. "Sweet Lord," whispered Rebecca, and Sarah Marie quickly put her arm around her sister's shoulders. "Remember what we talked about," she murmured, just loud enough for both her sisters to hear. "We been lost in the woods." Emma stood between them, swaying slightly on her feet, her small face turned up toward the sun like a flower seeking light. She hadn't spoken yet, but she reached for Sarah Marie's hand and held on tight. "Well, would you look at that," said another voice, and Sarah Marie turned to see a man in a captain's uniform approaching. He was older than Private McKenna, maybe 30 or so, with dark hair and the kind of mustache that took careful tending. His uniform was cleaner than the other soldiers, and when he walked, men stepped aside to let him pass. "Captain Morrison," Private McKenna said, coming to attention with a snap that made Sarah Marie jump. "Found these children in the old well, sir. Appears they've been lost in the woods, probably since yesterday." Captain Morrison studied the 3 sisters with pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Sarah Marie felt those eyes taking in their torn dresses, their tangled hair, the way they huddled together like scared rabbits. She tried to remember what Private McKenna had told her, tried to look like a child who'd been lost in the woods instead of one who'd watched her world burn from the bottom of a well. "Lost in the woods," Captain Morrison repeated, his voice flat and unreadable. "That's a mighty convenient story, Private." "Sir." Private McKenna's voice was steady, but Sarah Marie could hear something underneath it, some tension that made her stomach clench with fresh fear. "8 days ago, we cleared this settlement of Confederate sympathizers and traitors to the Union cause," Captain Morrison said, his eyes never leaving Sarah Marie's face. "Funny thing about children, Private McKenna. They got a way of hiding when trouble comes calling. And they got a way of seeing things they shouldn't see." Sarah Marie felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Beside her, Rebecca was trembling, and Emma had pressed her face against Sarah Marie's skirt like she was trying to disappear. "Now, Captain," Private McKenna said carefully, "these are just children. Even if they did see something, what harm could 3 little girls do to the Union cause?" Captain Morrison's smile was thin and cold as winter wind. "Private McKenna, you seem to have developed a soft spot for Confederate spawn. That's not a quality I admire in my soldiers." "They're just children, sir," Private McKenna repeated, and Sarah Marie heard something in his voice that might have been pleading. "Innocent children who ain't done nothing wrong." "Innocent." Captain Morrison tasted the word like it was something bitter. "Tell me, Private, what do you think happens to innocent Confederate children when they grow up? Do they forget what they saw? Do they forgive and forget the necessary actions of war?" Sarah Marie understood then, with a clarity that cut through her like a blade, exactly what Captain Morrison was suggesting. She felt Rebecca's hand slip into hers, felt Emma's small body pressed against her side, and knew that all their hiding, all their silence, all their careful pretending was about to come to nothing. But Private McKenna stepped forward, placing himself between the captain and the 3 sisters. "Sir, with respect, these children ain't a threat to nobody. They're half-starved and scared out of their minds. Even if they did see something, who's gonna believe the word of 3 little girls against the official reports?" "You'd be surprised what people believe, Private." Captain Morrison's voice was getting harder. "And you'd be surprised how quickly little girls grow into women who remember things they shouldn't remember and tell stories they shouldn't tell." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight, and Sarah Marie found herself holding her breath again, just like in the well. Around them, other soldiers had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation between their captain and the young private who'd pulled 3 children from a well. "I won't do it, sir," Private McKenna said finally, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the morning air. "I won't harm children, no matter what orders you give me." Captain Morrison's face went dark with anger. "You're refusing a direct order, Private?" "I'm refusing to murder children, sir. If that's insubordination, then so be it." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Sarah Marie realized she was witnessing something that would change all their lives forever. Private McKenna had just chosen to protect them, knowing full well what it might cost him. Captain Morrison's hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol, and several other soldiers shifted nervously. The morning air, which had seemed so clean and bright after 8 days in the well, now felt thick with tension and the promise of violence. "Private McKenna," Captain Morrison said, his voice deadly quiet, "you will carry out your orders, or you will face the consequences of mutiny in wartime." "Then I reckon I'll face the consequences," Private McKenna replied, and Sarah Marie heard no tremor in his voice now, no uncertainty. He'd made his choice, and he was standing by it. Captain Morrison drew his pistol in one smooth motion, pointing it not at Private McKenna, but at Sarah Marie herself. "Then perhaps I should give the order to someone who understands the necessities of war." Sarah Marie felt the world narrow down to the black circle of the gun barrel pointed at her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there and wait for the explosion that would end everything. But Private McKenna moved faster than thought, stepping directly into the line of fire. "No, sir," he said, his voice steady as bedrock. "You want to shoot children, you're gonna have to shoot me first." The standoff stretched into eternity, 2 men facing each other across a gulf of moral choice while 3 small girls huddled together and waited to learn whether they would live or die. Around them, the other soldiers watched in tense silence, some with expressions of approval, others with fear or disgust. Finally, Captain Morrison lowered his weapon. "You're under arrest, Private McKenna," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Sergeant Willis, take this man into custody. Charge him with insubordination and mutiny in the face of the enemy." "Yes, sir," came a reluctant voice from somewhere behind Sarah Marie. As the sergeant moved forward to arrest the young man who'd saved their lives, Private McKenna looked down at Sarah Marie one last time. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "Lost in the woods yesterday, fell in the well this morning. And remember that there's good people in this world, even when it don't seem like it." Then the sergeant was leading him away, and Sarah Marie was left standing in the ruins of her world with her 2 sisters and a company of soldiers who might still decide their fate with a bullet. Captain Morrison holstered his pistol and studied the 3 girls again, his pale eyes calculating. "Sergeant Willis," he called out. "Yes, sir." "When you're done securing the prisoner, I want you to escort these children to the nearest settlement. Tell them you found them lost in the woods." Relief flooded through Sarah Marie so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. They were going to live. Private McKenna's sacrifice had bought them their lives. "Yes, sir," Sergeant Willis replied. "What about supplies for them, sir? They look half-starved." Captain Morrison was already walking away, his attention turned to other matters. "Give them what you can spare. And Sergeant, make sure they understand the importance of telling the right story about how they came to be lost." "Understood, sir." As the captain disappeared among his men, Sergeant Willis approached the 3 sisters. He was an older man, maybe 40, with graying hair and kind brown eyes that reminded Sarah Marie painfully of her father. "Come on now, girls," he said gently. "Let's get you some food and water, and then we'll see about finding you a safe place to stay." Sarah Marie nodded, not trusting her voice. As they walked away from the ruins of Millbrook Settlement, she looked back once to see Private McKenna being loaded into a wagon with his hands bound behind his back. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw him nod slightly, as if to say she'd done well, that she was going to be all right. She wanted to call out to him, to thank him, to tell him she'd never forget what he'd done for them. But she knew better than to draw attention to their connection now. Instead, she squeezed her sister's hands and whispered a prayer for the young soldier who'd chosen mercy over orders, justice over duty, and 3 small lives over his own freedom. The road ahead was long and uncertain, leading toward an unknown future in a world forever changed by war. But they were alive, and they were together, and somewhere behind them, a good man was paying the price for doing the right thing. Sarah Marie Hutchins walked toward that uncertain future with her head held high, carrying the weight of survival and the burden of memory, knowing that someday, somehow, she would find a way to repay the debt she owed to Private Daniel McKenna. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm against the rutted road as they carried the 3 sisters away from everything they'd ever known toward an uncertain future in Coopersville, 20 miles south of the ruins that had once been home. Sergeant Willis had wrapped them in spare army blankets and shared his own hardtack and water, but Sarah Marie could barely swallow past the knot of grief and fear lodged in her throat like a stone. "How much farther?" Rebecca asked, her voice small and tired. She'd been brave through most of the day's journey, but as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, exhaustion was taking its toll on all of them. "Not much more now," Sergeant Willis replied kindly. He'd been nothing but gentle with them since they'd left the settlement, speaking in the soft tones a man might use with wounded animals. "Mrs. Patterson in Coopersville runs a boarding house. She'll see you're fed proper and have clean clothes to wear." Emma hadn't spoken at all during the journey, just sat pressed against Sarah Marie's side and stared at the passing countryside with eyes too old for her 6-year-old face. Sometimes she would reach into the pocket of her torn dress and pull out a small wooden doll that Papa had carved for her last Christmas, holding it tight before tucking it away again like she was afraid someone might take it from her. Sarah Marie watched the familiar landscape roll by and tried not to think about Private McKenna, tried not to wonder what was happening to him now that he'd been arrested for protecting them. But the image of his face kept rising in her mind, young and frightened but determined, choosing to do right even when it cost him everything. "Sergeant Willis," she said carefully, "what happens to soldiers who don't follow orders?" The older man's hands tightened slightly on the wagon reins, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Depends on the orders, child. And depends on the commanding officer. But if a soldier thinks an order is wrong, sometimes a man's got to choose between following orders and following his conscience," Sergeant Willis said quietly. "Ain't never an easy choice, and there's always a price to pay either way." Sarah Marie felt tears burning behind her eyes again. She wanted to ask more questions, wanted to know if Private McKenna would be all right, if there was anything she could do to help him. But she was just a 14-year-old girl with no family, no money, and no power to change anything. The town of Coopersville appeared ahead of them as the sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across neat rows of houses and shops that looked untouched by the war that had swept through their own settlement like a destroying angel. Sarah Marie felt a flutter of something that might have been hope as she saw smoke rising from chimneys, lamplight beginning to glow in windows, and people moving about their evening business as if the world hadn't ended 8 days ago. Sergeant Willis guided the wagon down the main street to a large white house with a painted sign that read, "Patterson's Boarding House. Clean rooms, good meals, Christian atmosphere." A woman appeared on the front porch as they approached, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron and squinting at them in the fading light. "Mrs. Patterson," Sergeant Willis called out as he brought the wagon to a stop. "These children here need a place to stay. They've been lost in the woods, and their folks." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Their folks ain't able to care for them just now." Mrs. Patterson came down the porch steps, her sharp eyes taking in the 3 sisters huddled together in the wagon bed. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of sturdy build that spoke of hard work and practical living. "Lost in the woods, you say?" Her voice carried a slight note of skepticism that made Sarah Marie's stomach clench with fresh worry. "How long they been missing?" "Since yesterday," Sergeant Willis replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Found them this morning in an old well, half-starved and scared near to death. Mrs. Patterson's gaze shifted to Sarah Marie, studying her face with the intensity of a woman who'd raised children of her own and could spot a lie from 50 paces. "Is that right, child? You been wandering in the woods since yesterday?" Sarah Marie felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Everything depended on the story they told, on whether this woman would believe them or start asking questions that might lead back to the truth of what they'd witnessed. "Yes, ma'am," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "We got lost yesterday evening, and we been walking ever since. This morning we tried to get water from that old well, and Emma fell in. Then I went down to help her, and Rebecca tried to help us both, and we all got stuck down there until the soldier found us." It wasn't entirely a lie, Sarah Marie told herself. They had been lost, in a way. And they had been in the well when Private McKenna found them. The rest was just details that didn't need telling. Mrs. Patterson continued to study them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Well then, you poor things must be half dead with hunger and exhaustion. Come on inside and let's get you cleaned up and fed proper." She turned to Sergeant Willis. "Will you be staying the night, Sergeant?" "No, ma'am, I need to catch up with my unit. But I'd be obliged if you'd take good care of these girls. They've been through more than children should have to bear." As Sergeant Willis helped them down from the wagon, Sarah Marie felt a sudden panic at the thought of him leaving. He was their last connection to Private McKenna, the last reminder that there were good people in the world who would risk everything to protect the innocent. "Sergeant," she said quickly, catching his sleeve as he prepared to climb back onto the wagon seat. "The soldier who found us, Private McKenna. Will he be all right?" Sergeant Willis's expression grew troubled, and he glanced toward Mrs. Patterson before leaning down to speak quietly. "I don't rightly know, child. But you remember what he told you about good people in this world. Sometimes doing the right thing is its own reward, even when the cost is high." With that, he climbed back onto the wagon and drove away into the gathering dusk, leaving the three sisters standing on the porch of a stranger's house in a town they'd never seen before. Mrs. Patterson ushered them inside, through a front parlor furnished with sturdy chairs and a well-worn sofa, past a dining room where the smell of beef stew and fresh bread made Sarah Marie's stomach cramp with sudden, desperate hunger. They hadn't had a proper meal in 8 days, living on nothing but the water from the well and the few scraps of cornbread Mama had pressed into her hands that last morning. "Up these stairs now," Mrs. Patterson said, leading them to the second floor. "I've got a room you girls can share, at least until we figure out what's to become of you." The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds covered in colorful quilts and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. After 8 days in the well, it looked like the finest hotel room Sarah Marie had ever imagined. "There's clean water in that pitcher, and I'll bring up some soap and towels," Mrs. Patterson said. "Get yourselves washed up while I fix you something to eat. And children." She paused in the doorway, her expression stern but not unkind. "I don't know what really happened to you, and I ain't gonna press you for details tonight. But this is a Christian house, and we don't abide lies or deception. When you're ready to tell the truth about where you come from and what happened to your folks, I'll be ready to listen." After she left, the 3 sisters stood in the middle of the room and looked at each other. For the first time since they'd climbed out of the well, they were alone together, without soldiers or strangers watching their every move. "Sarah Marie," Rebecca whispered, "are we gonna tell her? About Mama and Papa, about what we saw?" Sarah Marie sank down on one of the beds, suddenly feeling every one of her 14 years and then some. The weight of responsibility for her sisters, for keeping them safe and keeping their secrets, felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "Private McKenna said to stick to the story about being lost in the woods. But Mrs. Patterson seems like she might help us if she knew the truth." "What if she don't believe us?" Rebecca asked. "What if she thinks we're lying about the soldiers?" That was the fear that had been gnawing at Sarah Marie ever since they'd been pulled from the well. Who would believe that Union soldiers had massacred an entire settlement? Who would take the word of 3 orphaned children against the official reports of the army? Emma climbed up onto the bed beside Sarah Marie and curled against her side, still clutching her wooden doll. For the first time since that terrible morning 8 days ago, she spoke. "I want Mama," she whispered, her voice so small and broken it made Sarah Marie's heart crack clean in two. "I know, baby," Sarah Marie murmured, wrapping her arms around her littlest sister. "I want Mama too. But she ain't coming back, and we got to take care of each other now." "Are the bad soldiers coming back?" Emma asked. "No," Sarah Marie said firmly. "They're gone, and they ain't coming back. We're safe now." She hoped she was telling the truth. She hoped the nightmare was really over and they could start to build some kind of life in this new place. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that as long as Captain Morrison was still out there, as long as men like him wore uniforms and gave orders, none of them would ever be truly safe. Mrs. Patterson returned with towels and a bar of lavender soap, followed by a young woman about Sarah Marie's age carrying a tray loaded with bowls of stew, thick slices of bread, and glasses of fresh milk. "This is my daughter Lucy," Mrs. Patterson said. "She's about your age, I'd guess," she added, nodding towards Sarah Marie. "Lucy, these are the girls I told you about. Sarah Marie, Rebecca, and Emma." Lucy Patterson had her mother's brown hair and practical build, but her eyes were softer, more curious than suspicious. She smiled shyly at the 3 sisters as she set the tray down on the small table by the window. "Mama said you been lost in the woods," Lucy said. "That must have been terrible scary." "It was," Sarah Marie replied carefully. "We're mighty grateful to your mama for taking us in." "Well, eat up now," Mrs. Patterson said. "You're thin as rails, all of you. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you some proper clothes and figuring out what's to be done." The stew was the best thing Sarah Marie had ever tasted, rich with vegetables and tender beef, seasoned with herbs that made her think of Mama's cooking on Sunday afternoons. She tried to eat slowly, but her body was desperate for nourishment after 8 days of near starvation. Beside her, Rebecca and Emma were devouring their meals with the single-minded focus of children who'd forgotten what it felt like to have full bellies. "Slow down there," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Food ain't going nowhere. You eat too fast after being hungry so long, you'll just make yourselves sick." When they'd finished eating, Lucy helped them wash with the warm water and lavender soap while Mrs. Patterson went to find nightgowns that might fit them. The feeling of being clean again, of having soap-scented hair and skin that didn't smell of fear and desperation, was almost overwhelming. "Where did you live before you got lost?" Lucy asked as she helped Emma into a nightgown that was too big but clean and soft. Sarah Marie felt her heart skip a beat. "Up north a ways," she said vaguely. "Small place. You probably wouldn't know it. Was it near where the fighting's been?" Lucy's voice was curious, not suspicious, but Sarah Marie still felt the familiar clench of fear in her stomach. "Some," she admitted. "There's been soldiers through most everywhere lately." "Mama says the war's gonna be over soon," Lucy confided. "Says President Lincoln's gonna win and then everything will go back to how it was before." Sarah Marie wanted to tell her that some things could never go back to how they were before, that some changes carved themselves so deep into a person's soul they became part of who you were forever. But Lucy was young and innocent, living in a town that hadn't been touched by the kind of horror that had visited Millbrook Settlement. There was no point in stealing her hope. "I pray you're right," Sarah Marie said instead. After Lucy and her mother left them alone for the night, the 3 sisters lay together in one of the narrow beds, holding each other close despite the warmth of the spring evening. For 8 days, they'd been pressed together in the darkness of the well, and none of them seemed ready to sleep apart just yet. "Sarah Marie," Rebecca whispered in the darkness, "do you think Private McKenna has a family somewhere?" Sarah Marie had been wondering the same thing. He'd looked so young, barely more than a boy himself, but old enough to be married, old enough to have children of his own who might be wondering where their papa was and why he wasn't coming home. "I don't know," she whispered back. But I hope so. I hope he's got people who love him and are praying for him. Do you think we'll ever see him again? The question hung in the air between them like a wish that might or might not come true. Sarah Marie wanted to say yes, wanted to promise that somehow, someday, they would find a way to thank Private McKenna for what he'd done for them. But she was learning that the world didn't always work the way you wanted it to, that good people sometimes disappeared and bad people sometimes won. I don't know, she said again. But I know we ain't never gonna forget him. And maybe someday, when we're grown up and can take care of ourselves, we'll find a way to help somebody else the way he helped us. Promise? Emma's voice was tiny in the darkness. I promise, Sarah Marie said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of sorts. Mrs. Patterson fed them well and provided clean clothes that Lucy had outgrown or that had been donated by other families in town. She enrolled Rebecca in the local school and found simple chores for Sarah Marie to do around the boarding house. Sweeping floors, helping with laundry, tending the kitchen garden, in exchange for their room and board. Emma was too young for school and too traumatized to be left alone, so she spent her days following Sarah Marie around the boarding house like a small, silent shadow. She rarely spoke unless directly questioned, and even then her answers were usually just nods or shakes of her head. The wooden doll never left her hands. Sarah Marie threw herself into the work with desperate intensity, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. Sweeping floors and hanging laundry were simple, honest work that had clear beginnings and endings, unlike the tangle of grief and fear and uncertainty that lived in her heart. Lucy Patterson became a tentative friend, chatting with Sarah Marie as they worked side by side in the kitchen or hung clothes on the line behind the house. She was curious about their story but polite enough not to press when Sarah Marie deflected her questions. Still, Sarah Marie could see the doubt growing in Lucy's eyes as the days passed and their tale of being lost in the woods began to seem less and less plausible. Sarah Marie, Lucy said one afternoon as they shelled peas on the back porch, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Sarah Marie replied, though her stomach immediately tensed with worry. "That first night, when you were eating supper, you said grace in a way I ain't never heard before. The words were different." Sarah Marie's hands stilled on the pea pod she was splitting. She'd been so hungry, so grateful for the first real meal they'd had in over a week, that she'd automatically spoken the blessing her father had taught her, the one their family had said before every meal for as long as she could remember. "My papa taught it to me," she said carefully. "He said it was the way his papa said it, and his papa before him." It sounded almost like the way folks talk up in the Carolina mountains, Lucy said thoughtfully. "My aunt lives up that way, and when she visits, she talks different than we do here." Sarah Marie forced herself to keep shelling peas, to keep her voice casual. "Could be. Folks move around a lot these days, what with the war and all." Lucy was quiet for a moment, but Sarah Marie could feel her watching, thinking. "Sarah Marie, you know you can trust Mama and me, don't you? If something bad happened to your folks, if you're running from something, we want to help." The kindness in Lucy's voice made Sarah Marie's throat tight with unshed tears. She wanted so desperately to tell someone the truth, to unburden herself of the terrible secret they carried. But Private McKenna's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her to stick to their story, to keep themselves safe by staying silent. "We ain't running from nothing," Sarah Marie said quietly. "We just got lost, like we told you." Lucy nodded, but Sarah Marie could see she wasn't convinced. "All right. But if you ever want to talk about it, about what really happened, I'm here to listen." That night, as the three sisters lay together in their shared bed, Rebecca voiced the worry that had been growing in all their minds. "They don't believe us," she whispered. "Mrs. Patterson and Lucy both know we ain't telling the whole truth." "But they ain't throwing us out," Sarah Marie pointed out. "They're still feeding us and giving us a place to sleep." "For now," Rebecca said. "But what happens when they decide they want real answers? What happens if they start asking around, trying to find out where we really come from?" It was a fear that kept Sarah Marie awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and listening to her sisters breathe beside her. They couldn't stay in Coopersville forever, living on charity and half-truths. Eventually, Mrs. Patterson would expect them to contact relatives or make some kind of permanent arrangement for their care. And when that day came, what would they do? The answer came sooner than she'd expected, in the form of a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, nearly 3 weeks after they'd been pulled from the well. Sarah Marie was sweeping the front porch when she saw the postal rider approaching, and something about the official look of the envelope he handed to Mrs. Patterson made her stomach drop with dread. Mrs. Patterson read the letter twice, her expression growing more troubled with each reading. Then she folded it carefully and went inside, calling for Lucy to watch the front desk while she had a word with their guests. She found Sarah Marie in the kitchen, helping to prepare the noon meal, with Emma sitting quietly at the small table and Rebecca at school. "Sarah Marie, I need to speak with you," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice gentle but serious. "Emma, honey, why don't you go out to the garden and see if the tomatoes need watering?" Emma slipped away without a word, leaving Sarah Marie alone with Mrs. Patterson and the terrible certainty that their careful house of lies was about to come tumbling down. "This letter came from the Territorial Government Office," Mrs. Patterson said, holding up the official envelope. "They're looking for 3 sisters named Hutchins who went missing from a settlement called Millbrook. Sarah Marie, Rebecca, and Emma Hutchins." Sarah Marie felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, to try to maintain their story, but no words came out. "The letter says their parents were killed in an Indian raid 3 weeks ago, and the girls are believed to have fled into the woods," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice growing softer. "It says there's a reward for information leading to their safe return, and that they're wanted as material witnesses to the attack." The carefully constructed lie crumbled in Sarah Marie's mind like a house built on sand. Indian raid. Material witnesses. Someone had created an official story that was almost as false as the one they'd been telling, but this version served the needs of Captain Morrison and his superiors. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah Marie began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Child, I know you ain't been telling me the truth about what happened to you," Mrs. Patterson said, sitting down at the table and gesturing for Sarah Marie to do the same. "I've known it from the first night. But I also know that sometimes people lie because they're scared, not because they're trying to cause harm." Sarah Marie sank into the chair across from her, feeling suddenly very young and very tired. "We ain't done nothing wrong." "I believe that," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "But this letter says the territorial marshal is sending a deputy to collect you and take you back north to testify about what you saw. That's supposed to happen day after tomorrow." The room seemed to spin around Sarah Marie as the implications sank in. They would be taken back to the scene of the massacre, forced to tell their story to officials who had already decided it was an Indian raid. And if they contradicted that official version, if they told the truth about what they'd really seen. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah Marie said desperately, "please don't let them take us. Please. Child, I can't fight the territorial government. But I can listen to the truth, if you're ready to tell it. And maybe, if I know what really happened, I can find a way to help." Sarah Marie looked into Mrs. Patterson's kind, weathered face and made a decision that would change everything. The lies had protected them this far, but they wouldn't protect them from what was coming. If they were going to survive, if they were going to save themselves and honor Private McKenna's sacrifice, they needed allies who knew the truth. "It wasn't Indians," Sarah Marie said quietly. "It was soldiers. Union soldiers, led by a Captain Morrison. They came through our settlement and killed everyone. Everyone except us, because we hid in the well for 8 days until they found us." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale, but she didn't interrupt, didn't question or doubt. She just listened as Sarah Marie told her everything, about Mama's warning, about the screaming and the smoke, about 8 days of darkness and fear and the bitter taste of well water. She told her about Private McKenna, about his kindness and his courage and the terrible price he'd paid for refusing to murder children. When Sarah Marie finished, the kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant sound of Emma playing in the garden. "Sweet Lord," Mrs. Patterson whispered finally. "Those poor people. Your poor parents." "The letter says we're witnesses to an Indian raid," Sarah Marie said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "They're gonna make us lie about what we saw, ain't they? They're gonna make us say it was Indians who killed our folks." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the official letter with its government seal and formal language. When she looked up, her expression was determined. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she said firmly. "Child, what happened to your settlement was murder, plain and simple. And that young soldier who protected you, he deserves better than to rot in prison for doing the right thing." "But what can we do?" Sarah Marie asked. "We're just children. Nobody's gonna believe us against the word of the army." "Maybe not," Mrs. Patterson admitted. "But there's people in this territory who believe in justice, who won't stand for covering up murder just because the killers wore uniforms. People who remember that soldiers are supposed to protect the innocent, not slaughter them." She stood up and began pacing the kitchen, her mind clearly working. "The deputy ain't coming until day after tomorrow. That gives us a little time to figure out what to do." "You're gonna help us?" Sarah Marie could hardly believe it. "Child, I've got 2 sons fighting in this war, believing they're fighting for what's right and just. If I let you be forced to lie about murder and let that young soldier suffer for doing his duty to God and conscience, then what are my boys fighting for?" For the first time since they'd climbed out of the well, Sarah Marie felt something that might have been hope blooming in her chest. They weren't alone anymore. They had an ally, someone who believed them and was willing to fight for the truth. "What do we do?" she asked. Mrs. Patterson smiled grimly. "First we pray. Then we get busy. There's a federal judge in the territorial capital who's known for being fair and honest. If we can get your story to him before that deputy comes calling, we might have a chance at real justice." As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes bright with curiosity and concern. "Mama? Is everything all right? I heard voices." Mrs. Patterson looked at her daughter, then at Sarah Marie. "Lucy, these girls need our help. Real help. Are you willing to do whatever it takes to see justice done?" Lucy's expression grew serious as she looked between her mother and Sarah Marie. "What kind of help?" "The kind that might get us in trouble with the authorities," Mrs. Patterson said honestly. "The kind that means standing up for what's right even when it ain't easy or safe." Lucy didn't hesitate. "Then I'm in. What do we need to do?" And for the first time since Private McKenna had been led away in chains, Sarah Marie began to believe that maybe, just maybe, good could triumph over evil after all. The territorial courthouse in Carson City rose from the dusty street like a monument to justice, its red brick walls and white columns speaking of order and law in a land where both were often in short supply. Sarah Marie clutched Rebecca's hand as they climbed the courthouse steps, with Emma pressed close to her other side and Mrs. Patterson leading the way with the determined stride of a woman on a mission from God himself. It had taken them 2 days of hard travel to reach the territorial capital, riding in Mrs. Patterson's wagon through spring storms that turned the roads to mud and made every mile a struggle. They'd arrived just hours ahead of the deputy who'd been sent to collect them, and Sarah Marie's heart hadn't stopped racing since they'd walked into Judge Harrison's chambers that morning. Federal Judge William Harrison was a tall, spare man with silver hair and eyes the color of winter sky. He'd listened to their story without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each detail Sarah Marie shared. Now, as afternoon shadows stretched across his oak-paneled office, he was studying the official report that described the Millbrook Settlement massacre as an Indian raid. "These are serious allegations, young lady," Judge Harrison said finally, setting the papers aside and looking directly at Sarah Marie. "You're telling me that Union soldiers, acting under orders, murdered an entire settlement of civilians?" "Yes, sir," Sarah Marie replied, her voice steady despite the fear that made her hands shake. "Captain Morrison gave the order. Said they were Confederate sympathizers and traitors." And you witnessed this yourself? We heard the screaming, Sarah Marie said quietly. We saw the smoke from the burning houses. We hid in that well for 8 days while they stayed in our settlement, taking what they wanted and making sure nobody survived to tell what really happened. Judge Harrison turned his attention to Rebecca, who sat ramrod straight in her chair despite being pale with exhaustion from their journey. Rebecca, is that your recollection as well? Yes, sir, Rebecca said, her young voice clear and firm. We saw them ride in that morning. Mama made us hide because she knew they wasn't coming peaceful. And Emma? The judge's voice grew gentler as he addressed the youngest sister, who hadn't spoken since they'd entered his office. Emma looked up at Sarah Marie, seeking permission. When Sarah Marie nodded encouragingly, Emma pulled her wooden doll from her pocket and held it tight. The bad soldiers killed Mama and Papa, she whispered, so quietly Judge Harrison had to lean forward to hear her. But the good soldier saved us. Tell me about this good soldier, Judge Harrison said, his attention sharpening. Sarah Marie felt her heart clench as she thought of Private McKenna, wondering where he was now, what had become of him after his arrest. His name was Private Daniel McKenna. When they found us in the well, Captain Morrison wanted to kill us so we couldn't tell anybody what we'd seen. But Private McKenna wouldn't let him. He stood between us and the captain's gun and said he wouldn't hurt children no matter what orders he got. And what happened to Private McKenna? They arrested him, Sarah Marie said, tears burning behind her eyes. Last we saw, they were loading him into a wagon with his hands tied behind his back. Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him as he considered what he'd heard. Finally, he turned to Mrs. Patterson, who had remained silent throughout the questioning. Mrs. Patterson, you understand the gravity of what these children are saying? If their account is accurate, we're talking about war crimes of the highest order. I understand completely, Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. And I believe every word they've told you. These children have been through hell itself, and they deserve justice for what was done to their family and their community. The problem, Judge Harrison said slowly, is that their version of events directly contradicts the official military report. According to this document, signed by Captain Morrison himself, the settlement was attacked by hostile Indians. The soldiers arrived afterward to find the destruction and no survivors. Then Captain Morrison is a liar as well as a murderer, Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose at her directness, but he didn't rebuke her. Instead, he stood and walked to the window that looked out over the main street of Carson City, where people went about their daily business unaware of the drama unfolding in the courthouse. Mrs. Patterson, these are dangerous accusations to make against a Union officer in wartime. Even if the children are telling the truth, proving it will be nearly impossible. It's their word against an official military report supported by an entire regiment. What about Private McKenna? Sarah Marie asked suddenly. If he's still alive, he could tell you what really happened. He was there. He saw everything. Judge Harrison turned back to them, his expression thoughtful. That's assuming we can locate him and that he's willing to testify against his superior officers. Soldiers who break ranks rarely fare well in military custody. The words hit Sarah Marie like a physical blow. She'd been holding on to the hope that Private McKenna was still alive somewhere, that his sacrifice had meaning beyond just saving their lives. The thought that he might be dead, that his courage might have cost him everything, was almost unbearable. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson said quietly, I know you got a reputation for being fair and just. These children ain't asking for revenge. They're asking for truth. And that young soldier deserves better than to disappear into some military prison for doing what any decent man would do. Before Judge Harrison could respond, there was a sharp knock on his office door. His clerk entered, looking flustered and apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, but there's a federal marshal here with a territorial deputy. They're demanding to see the Hutchins children immediately. Sarah Marie felt her stomach drop to her shoes. They'd run out of time. The deputy had caught up with them, and now they would be forced back into the official story, compelled to lie about what they'd witnessed or face consequences she didn't want to imagine. "Show them in," Judge Harrison said calmly, but Sarah Marie caught the look he exchanged with Mrs. Patterson, a silent communication that might have been reassurance or might have been farewell. The door opened to admit two men who filled the room with the authority of federal law enforcement. The marshal was a middle-aged man with a graying beard and hard eyes that missed nothing. The territorial deputy was younger, nervous-looking, clearly uncomfortable with whatever orders he'd been given. "Judge Harrison," the marshal said without preamble, "I'm Federal Marshal James Crawford. This is Deputy Thompson. We're here to collect the Hutchins children for transport back to the site of the Indian attack at Millbrook Settlement." "I see," Judge Harrison replied evenly. "And the purpose of this transport?" "The children are material witnesses to the attack. The territorial government needs their testimony to complete the official investigation." Sarah Marie felt Rebecca's hand slip into hers, felt Emma press closer to her side. This was the moment they'd been dreading, when they would be forced to choose between truth and survival. "Marshal Crawford," Judge Harrison said slowly, "before you take these children anywhere, I think you should hear what they have to say about what they witnessed at Millbrook Settlement." The marshal's expression hardened. "Judge, with all due respect, these children have already been through enough trauma. The last thing they need is to be questioned repeatedly about the same terrible events." "Oh, I think they need to be questioned very thoroughly indeed," Judge Harrison replied, his voice taking on an edge that made both lawmen straighten. "Particularly about certain discrepancies between their account and the official military report." Marshal Crawford's eyes narrowed. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The kind that suggest the attack on Millbrook Settlement was not carried out by Indians at all," Judge Harrison said quietly. "The kind that suggest Union soldiers, acting under orders, massacred an entire community of civilians and then falsified reports to cover up their crimes." The silence that followed was so complete Sarah Marie could hear her own heartbeat. Marshal Crawford's face had gone pale, while Deputy Thompson looked like he might be sick. "That's a serious accusation, Judge," Marshal Crawford said finally. "Yes, it is. And it's one that deserves a thorough investigation before these children are compelled to give any testimony whatsoever." Marshal Crawford studied the three sisters with new intensity, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. "Children, is what the judge says true? Were there soldiers at your settlement?" Sarah Marie looked up at Judge Harrison, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked at Mrs. Patterson, who squeezed her shoulder gently. Finally, she looked at her sisters, who were both watching her with complete trust. "Yes, sir," Sarah Marie said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Union soldiers led by Captain Morrison. They came to our settlement and killed everyone. They said we were Confederate sympathizers, but we wasn't nothing but farmers trying to get by. They murdered our parents and our neighbors and burned our houses, and then they were gonna kill us too until Private McKenna stopped them." "Private McKenna?" Marshal Crawford's voice was sharp with interest. "He was young, maybe 17 or 18, Sarah Marie continued. "He found us hiding in the well and wouldn't let Captain Morrison hurt us. Said he wouldn't murder children no matter what orders he got. They arrested him for it." Marshal Crawford exchanged a long look with Deputy Thompson, who seemed to be growing more uncomfortable by the moment. "Judge Harrison," the marshal said slowly, "if what these children are saying is true, we're looking at potential war crimes." "That changes everything." "Indeed it does," Judge Harrison agreed. "Which is why I'm issuing a federal warrant for the arrest of Captain Morrison and his regiment pending a full investigation into the events at Millbrook Settlement." "Your Honor," Deputy Thompson spoke up for the first time, his voice strained, "I should tell you that I've already filed my report with the territorial government. I was instructed to collect these children and ensure they testified that the attack was carried out by hostile Indians." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Deputy Thompson had just confessed to being part of a conspiracy to cover up mass murder, and everyone in the room knew it. "Deputy Thompson," Judge Harrison said quietly. "You're hereby relieved of any authority over these children. Marshal Crawford, I'm placing them in federal protective custody until this matter can be properly investigated." "Understood, Your Honor," Marshal Crawford replied. "What about Private McKenna? If he's still alive, his testimony would be crucial." "I'll issue a writ of habeas corpus immediately," Judge Harrison said. "If he's being held in military custody, they'll have to produce him or explain why they can't." For the first time since they'd climbed out of the well, Sarah Marie felt something like hope blooming in her chest. They weren't going to be forced to lie. They weren't going to be silenced or disappeared. Someone with real authority was finally listening, finally taking action. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Judge Harrison said, "we find out the truth. All of it. And we make sure that justice is done, both for your family and for Private McKenna." The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed. Within a week, Marshal Crawford had tracked down Captain Morrison's regiment and served the federal warrant. The captain himself was found in a military hospital in Denver, recovering from wounds he claimed to have received in an engagement with Confederate forces. But Private Daniel McKenna was harder to find. The military records showed him as having been transferred to a disciplinary unit for insubordination, but the paperwork trail went cold after that. It took Marshal Crawford another week to discover that Private McKenna had been court-martialed and sentenced to hard labor at a military prison in Colorado Territory. When they finally brought him to Carson City to testify, Sarah Marie barely recognized the young man who had saved their lives. He was thinner, his face bearing the pallor of someone who'd been locked away from sunlight for too long. But his eyes were the same, kind and steady and unafraid. The trial was held in the same courthouse where Judge Harrison had first heard their story. Sarah Marie testified first, telling the truth about what had happened at Millbrook Settlement in clear, steady words that carried across the packed courtroom. Rebecca followed, and even Emma managed to whisper her account of the bad soldiers and the good soldier who had protected them. But it was Private McKenna's testimony that sealed Captain Morrison's fate. "I enlisted to defend my country and protect the innocent," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "What Captain Morrison ordered us to do at Millbrook Settlement was neither defense nor protection. It was murder, plain and simple. And when he ordered me to kill 3 small children who had witnessed his crimes, I refused. I would refuse again, even knowing the cost." Captain Morrison's defense was that he had been following orders to pacify Confederate sympathizers, but the prosecution quickly established that no such orders existed. The massacre at Millbrook Settlement had been Morrison's own initiative, carried out by soldiers who either followed his illegal orders or were too frightened to resist. The verdict, when it came, was swift and unanimous. Captain Morrison was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to hang. 3 of his subordinates received long prison sentences, while the rest of his unit was dishonorably discharged. Private McKenna's court-martial was overturned, and he was honorably discharged with full recognition of his service. More importantly, he was alive and free, his courage vindicated at last. After the trial, as autumn painted the mountains around Carson City in shades of gold and crimson, the question remained of what would become of the 3 Hutchins sisters. They had no family left, no home to return to, no clear path forward. The answer came from an unexpected source. "I'd like to adopt them," Mrs. Patterson announced one evening as they sat in the parlor of the boarding house where they'd been staying during the trial. "All 3 of them, if they'll have me." Sarah Marie felt tears spring to her eyes. In all the weeks of legal proceedings and testimony, she'd been so focused on seeking justice that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the future, about what would happen when the trial was over and the world moved on. "You'd want us?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Child, you've been part of my family since the day you walked into my boarding house," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "Lucy thinks of you girls as her sisters already, and I think of you as my daughters. If you're willing, I'd like to make it official." Rebecca and Emma looked to Sarah Marie, as they always did when important decisions needed to be made. Sarah Marie looked at Mrs. Patterson, this strong, kind woman who had risked everything to help them seek justice, and felt something that had been broken inside her heart begin to heal. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "We'd be honored to be your daughters." The adoption papers were signed on a crisp October morning, with Judge Harrison presiding and Private McKenna serving as one of the witnesses. After the ceremony, as they stood on the courthouse steps, Private McKenna pulled Sarah Marie aside. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that what you girls did, telling the truth even when it was dangerous, that took more courage than anything I did. Your parents would be proud of you." "What will you do now?" Sarah Marie asked. She'd heard he was planning to leave Colorado Territory, to start fresh somewhere new. "I'm thinking of going west, maybe California. Try my hand at farming or ranching, something peaceful." He smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, the smile reached his eyes. "What about you? What do you want to do when you grow up?" Sarah Marie thought about it for a moment, looking out over the bustling street where people went about their daily lives in peace and safety. "I want to help people," she said finally. "Maybe become a teacher, or a nurse, or... I don't know exactly. But I want to help people who can't help themselves, the way you helped us." "I think you'll do just fine," Private McKenna said. "You've got the heart for it." As winter settled over Coopersville and the Patterson family prepared for their first Christmas together, Sarah Marie often found herself thinking about the events that had brought them to this place. The massacre at Millbrook Settlement would always be a scar on her heart, and she would never stop missing her parents. But she'd learned something important about the nature of good and evil, about the power of ordinary people to choose what was right even when the cost was high. Private McKenna had chosen to protect 3 children rather than follow illegal orders. Mrs. Patterson had chosen to help them seek justice rather than stay silent and safe. Judge Harrison had chosen to listen to the truth rather than accept convenient lies. And in the end, those choices had mattered. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside the windows of their new home, the Patterson family gathered around their tree to exchange simple gifts and share stories. Emma, who had finally begun to speak freely again, told them about the wooden doll Papa had carved for her and how she'd held onto it through their darkest days. "It reminded me that Papa loved me," she said simply. "Even when I was scared, I knew he loved me." Sarah Marie felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her littlest sister, who had been so silent and withdrawn for so long, now chattering happily with Lucy about their plans for the next day. Rebecca was helping Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen, her laughter carrying through the house like music. They were healing, all of them. The nightmares still came sometimes, and there were moments when grief would hit like a physical blow. But they were together, they were safe, and they were loved. They had found their way from the darkness of that well to the light of a new family, a new life built on the foundation of truth and justice. As Sarah Marie tucked Emma into bed that night, her little sister looked up at her with eyes that were finally clear of shadows. "Sarah Marie, do you think Mama and Papa know we're all right now?" Sarah Marie smoothed Emma's hair back from her forehead, thinking of her parents and the love they'd shown their children even in their final moments, when Mama had risked everything to hide them from the coming storm. "I think they know," she said softly. "And I think they're proud of how brave you've been, how you helped tell the truth about what happened to them." "And they know about Private McKenna? About how he saved us?" "They know about all of it," Sarah Marie assured her. "They know about the good people who helped us, and they know we're gonna be all right." Emma smiled and closed her eyes, her wooden doll clutched safely in her hands. "Good. I'm gonna pray for Private McKenna tonight, that he finds a good place to live and is happy." "That's a fine prayer," Sarah Marie said, kissing her sister's forehead. "I'll pray the same thing." As she walked downstairs to join the rest of her new family by the Christmas tree, Sarah Marie felt the weight of gratitude settle around her shoulders like a warm shawl. They had survived the worst that human cruelty could inflict, and they had found their way to something better. They had learned that evil was real and terrible, but that good was real too, and sometimes, if people were brave enough to choose it, good could triumph. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities and hope. Sarah Marie would finish her education, help raise her sisters, and someday fulfill her promise to help others who couldn't help themselves. Rebecca would grow up strong and capable, her natural kindness tempered by hard-won wisdom. Emma would remember her parents' love and her wooden doll and the good soldier who had stood between her and harm. And somewhere in California, Private Daniel McKenna would build a new life on land of his own, knowing that his choice to do right had mattered, that 3 small lives had been saved by his courage and that justice had been served because he had refused to be part of evil. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the peaceful town of Coopersville, covering the world in pristine white and promising new beginnings with the coming spring. Inside the Patterson house, a family gathered around their Christmas tree gave thanks for the gift of each other and for the hard-won knowledge that even in the darkest times, there were still people willing to choose light over darkness, love over fear, and justice over convenience. The 3 sisters had survived by hiding in a well for 8 days. But they had truly been saved by the courage of good people who refused to let evil have the final word. And in the end, that made all the difference in the world.